Part 23. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 221. Then what should we do now? Now it seems that he has discovered it. We are spying in secret. If we gather the big-eyed monsters around us now, it may be too late. A teasing smile appeared on Long Xiaoshan's lips, and then he waved his hand gently. Judging from the current situation, we don't need to gather the big-eyed monsters again, because it's nothing meaning. Now that our conjecture has been verified, do you think we should go and see it? At this time, the man was slightly stunned at first, but after a moment he nodded like a chicken pecking at rice, his eyes full of excitement. Yes, what you said is indeed half true. Now our conjectures have been confirmed. Now that the conjectures have been confirmed, there is no need to worry about other things. It couldn't be more important. Long Xiaotian just nodded lightly, and then waved his hand. As long as you understand this matter, it doesn't matter about the other things. But the one who makes me very curious is probably the little guy named Lin Yu. You've sent people to keep a close eye on him recently. At this moment, Long Xiaotian said in a deep and unhurried voice. At this time, the man nodded slightly. Have you not found out the identity of this little guy until now? Long Xiaotian slowly turned his head and stared at the person in front of him with a somewhat complicated meaning in his eyes. There was a bit of helplessness in the eyes of the previous person, and the wry smile at the corner of his mouth began to become more and more obvious. It's true that we haven't found out. This little guy seems to appear out of thin air, coming and going without a trace. It's really mysterious. We also. After Long Xiaotian heard what he said, he just waved his hand impatiently. Okay, I know about this matter. You go down first and continue to investigate until the identity of the little guy is found. Until I get out, I want to see how powerful this little guy is. After hearing what Long Xiaotian said, everyone nodded their heads one after another, and then stepped back cautiously. And just after this moment, a figure suddenly appeared. The person's speed was extremely fast. In just one breath, he had already arrived in front of Long Xiaotian. This person seemed to be hiding. Just like this shadow in the dark. If an ordinary person encounters such a person, he will definitely be shocked. At this moment, the corners of Long Xiaoshan's mouth evoked a somewhat meaningful smile. He turned his head towards them and only glanced lightly. Why are you here? After the man whispered a few words softly into Long Xiaoshan's ear. Long Xiaoshan's expression changed instantly. He half squinted his eyes, a special color flashed in his eyes, and then he frowned and shook his head slightly. Are you sure what you said is true? Didn't you lie to me? Long Xiaoshan's eyes were fixed on that person, and that person's eyes were full of helplessness, and the corners of his mouth were even more wry. Even if I take the courage of this ambitious leopard, I will never dare to deceive you. This matter is absolutely true. Long Xiaotian just sighed heavily and looked into the distance with stern eyes, which seemed to be quite complex and throbbing. Alas, everything is safe in the mountains and seas. We can all hope for it. Things in the world are unpredictable, adversities are the same, and every thought in the world is caused by cause and effect. I just hope that this little guy will not be like the geniuses of the Dragon Kingdom before, and be plotted by these hateful guys. Long Xiaoshan's voice was unusually low and hoarse. And that man was also quite touched, and there was quite a bit of perseverance in his eyes. Believe me, this will never happen. Long Xiaotian nodded slightly, as long as it doesn't happen. Of course, that person also understood where Long Xiaoshan's heart was, so at this time he just stepped forward and patted Long Xiaoshan's shoulder gently, with a wry smile on the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were even more. It's quite a bit of helplessness. I understand very well what you are thinking now, but some things are not. The man's voice was low. After Long Xiaotian heard what the man said, he just smiled, and then waved his hand. I know what you want to say. It doesn't matter. I have my own sense of discretion in this matter. I'm a little tired. Let's go down first. And now in the ancient tomb. Lin Yu and Li Junzhong were fighting hard to separate, because the noise they made was too great, so all the participating experts from the 9 countries heard the noise and came over. After they rushed over, Lin Yu had a bit of an evil smile on his lips, and a bit of coldness flashed in his eyes. Then he suddenly stepped sideways and reached a place where he waved his arm and aimed at the man's chest, causing a sudden shock. The man only felt a huge force coming from his chest, and then a moment later, Li Junzhong felt a powerful force. That powerful force made everyone feel a little bit afraid. But although Li Junzhong withstood the blow forcefully, his expression only changed slightly, and he did not show any particular pain. A somewhat disdainful sneer appeared at the corner of Li Junzheng's mouth, and there was quite a bit of mockery in his eyes. I originally thought you might have some abilities, but now it seems that you are nothing more than that. You are simply weak and vulnerable. Li Junzhong said in a deep voice. At this time, he slowly stood up. Obviously, even Lin Yu never expected that this guy could be so durable. You must know that he used nearly 80% of his strength this time. With his strength, an ordinary domain master level master would probably be seriously injured by his blow this time. But the guy in front of him was obviously only a lord, but now he was unscathed, and he looked even more motivated to fight. So at this time, Lin Yu's eyes looked at Li Junzhong with a bit of coldness, his eyes were filled with a cold light, and the murderous intention in his body was also revealed in this way. And at this moment, he also had a rare look of solemnity on his face, and his brows were slightly condensed. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 222. I'm too lazy to talk to you about such nonsense. You are going to die no matter what today, and no one I say can keep you. Li Junzhong just spread his hands so gently, with a gloomy look in the corners of his eyes and brows. Why don't you think about it? Will you die first? Otherwise, we might as well make a bet. What do you think? Li Junzheng's eyes scanned Lin Yu's body back and forth. An ordinary person would definitely be suppressed by Li Junzheng's aura at this moment, but obviously he would not be overwhelmed by Li Junzheng's aura. Lin Yu just turned his head and glanced at Li Junzhong lightly, with a cold smile on the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were full of mockery. What do you want to bet on? Bet your life. Good. After Li Junzhong finished speaking, he suddenly jumped up, and then suddenly appeared next to Wang Yu the next second, his eyes fixed on Lin Yu. Just bet that this woman doesn't care how long it takes to die. I bet she can't last 10 seconds. After Li Junzhong finished speaking, he suddenly pushed towards Wang Yu's back and pushed out so hard that the violent force directly penetrated Wang Yu's heart. When Lin Yu saw this scene, his eyes seemed to be about to burst into flames. His eyes were fixed on Li Junzhong, and a cold murderous intention was displayed without reservation. Out. You bastard, you deserve to die. You have completely angered me today. I will leave you here today. You will definitely die. No matter what I say, no one can save you. But of course Lin Yu knew at this time that the top priority right now was not to kill this guy but to rescue Wang Yu first. Today, she won't die, but you will. Lin Yu quickly entered the system. Arya, is there any medicine that can save people's pulse? Lin Yu said in a deep voice, and then Arya appeared in front of Lin Yu. Her eyes were staring at Lin Yu, seeming to be quite entangled, and also seemed to be drinking. He seemed to be hesitant to speak. When Lin Yu saw Arya like this, he immediately understood that there should be such a medicine. If you have any, take them out first. The rejuvenation pill can indeed save her heart, but it is very likely that she will not be able to wake up for the rest of her life. Just redeem this rejuvenation pill. Lin Yu just said softly. After Arya heard what Lin Yu said, but if this happens, I'm afraid all the 1.3 million points in your account will be lost. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Arya said, his eyes were quite complicated, and then he nodded slightly. It doesn't matter, use them all to exchange for rejuvenation pills. Human lives are at stake, this pill is not important. Lin Yu just spoke unhurriedly. When Arya heard Lin Yu say this, her eyes seemed to have some profound meaning, and then she nodded slightly. Okay, then redeem this rejuvenation pill. At this moment, a small white jade porcelain bottle suddenly appeared in Lin Yu's palm. At this time, Arya's eyes were quite complicated. Lin Yu carefully opened the woman's mouth, and then carefully put the pill into Wang Yu's mouth. At this moment, she only saw a burst of emerald green light, which suddenly condensed in Wang Yu's heart. Obviously, even the guy from before was stunned when he saw the scene again. Li Junquan's eyes were full of disbelief, and his eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. At this time, Lin Yu stood up slowly, and then carried Wang Yu to Chen Bing's side. Chen Bing raised his head and glanced at Lin Yu. There was something in his cold eyes. Very moving. She's going to be okay, right? Lin Yu nodded gently, with some complexity flashing in his eyes. Yes, believe me, she will be fine. At this time, when Li Junsheng saw Wang Yu, who was still breathing, his eyes were full of disbelief, and then he started shaking his head crazily. Impossible, this is absolutely impossible, how could you possibly save her? She should be dead now, she should be dead. After Lin Yu heard what Li Junsheng said, a bit of gloomy murderous intent flashed in his eyes, and then the cold color in the corners of his eyes and brows began to become more and more cold. Just in this breath, he had already arrived in front of someone. Without saying a word, Lin Yu kicked Li Junsheng in the chest. The anger that entered his chest was overwhelming. In just a moment, he defeated Li Junsheng. You just seemed to have made a bet with me. The bet between the two of us seemed to be one life. I think you should give this life back to me now. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he began to attack Li Junsheng crazily. His fists hit Li Junsheng like a sudden storm. At this moment, Li Junsheng retreated step by step. At the end only then did he manage to stabilize his figure. Li Junsheng spat out a mouthful of blood. He slowly raised his head and stared at Lin Yu. A murderous intent quietly emerged from his body. Boy, you will regret it. After Li Junsheng finished speaking, he suddenly fluttered his wings. At this moment, he bit his tongue and spat out a mouthful of blood. He used his hand to draw an extremely mysterious and obscure spell in the air. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu's eyes were quite solemn. Even he had to admit that Li Junsheng was really quite capable, but even so, Lin Yu's anger had reached a level that was difficult to conceal. Today, you must die no matter what. Even Jesus can't stop you. Lin Yu suddenly stepped forward and came to Li Junsheng, and then his fists fell on Li Junsheng like a storm, and Li Junsheng was beaten and defeated. But even Lin Yu himself didn't know why Li Junsheng was hit so hard by him at this time, but his aura did not decrease but increased. This was really confusing. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 223. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu's eyes seemed to flash with a special light, and then the corners of his eyes and brows were filled with a kind of surprise. After waiting for this moment, Lin Yu seemed to suddenly understand something. You can actually absorb my power. This is really something I didn't expect. But at this time, when the man saw Lin Yu, he actually saw through him. At this time, he laughed so directly. There was a bit of madness in his eyes. When he looked at Lin Yu, he was even more satisfied. It was a kind of gloomy and cold, and the murderous intention on his body quietly emerged. I didn't expect you to be able to see through me, but so what? Even if you can see through me, what can I do? You will still die next, I said so. Li Junzhong suddenly jumped out towards Lin Yu again. His speed was extremely fast. He came to Lin Yu again in the blink of an eye, and then suddenly waved his arms. A punch hit Lin Yu's chest, causing Lin Yu's figure to take several steps back before he managed to stabilize his figure. Obviously, even Lin Yu didn't expect that this guy's strength had reached such a terrifying level. He took a breath of cold air and a gloomy look flashed in his eyes. He took a deep breath and calmed down his mood a little. At this time, he suddenly took a step forward, and then punched directly in front. In just a moment, Lin Yu's fist had already reached Li Junzhen's chest, but at this moment, Li Junzhen's figure actually took a few steps backwards at extremely high speed. Lin Yu could also find that Li Junzhong seemed to be much faster than before. At this time, Lin Yu half squinted his eyes, and his eyes were quite complicated. His brows were knitted together, and then he used his left leg as an axis, circled half a circle, and then kicked Li Junzhong on the forehead. If an ordinary person had been attacked by such a powerful force, he would have been dead long ago, but at this moment, Li Junzhong was still standing there, unscathed. A faint smile appeared at the corner of Li Junzhen's mouth, and his eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. Your strength doesn't seem to be enough. It seems that you are indeed a lot weaker. Li Junzhong said in a deep and unhurried voice. At this time, Lin Yu's face suddenly became ugly. He jumped up suddenly, and his fists hit Li Junzhong like a sudden storm. But at this moment, Li Junzhong actually refused to dodge. Lin Yu was beating there without moving at all. After fighting for a long time, even Lin Yu was a little tired. He turned his head towards Li Junzhong and just glanced coldly. The skill of turtle swallowing is indeed somewhat capable, but although this thing can absorb the enemy's power, if the power is too strong and exceeds one's own, I'm afraid it will explode and die. Lin Yu just spoke softly and unhurriedly. At this time, Li Junzhong didn't know why. When he saw Lin Yu's expression at this moment, a somewhat ominous premonition suddenly emerged in his heart, and his eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. You, what do you want to do? I'm warning you not to mess around. If you dare to mess around, you will definitely die by then, I said so. At this time, Lin Yu suddenly laughed like this, really? But I don't think so. At this moment, Li Junzhong didn't know why, but he suddenly had an ominous premonition in his heart, because he felt that what Lin Yu said might be true. He felt that Lin Yu was like a madman, and maybe what he said was right. What would it do? But if that was the case, it would probably require an extremely powerful force to explode himself. He was not sure whether Lin Yu had this kind of power. However, based on the principle of preferring to believe what he has rather than what he doesn't, Li Junzhong still quietly closed his own technique. At this time, Lin Yu seized this opportunity and suddenly stepped forward. In just a moment, he was at Li Junzhen's side again. He waved his arm and punched Li Junzhong directly on Li Junzhen's body. At this moment, Li Junzhong only felt a surge in his chest, and then his face suddenly turned ugly, just for a moment. Seeing Li Junzhen's appearance at this moment, Lin Yu stared at Li Junzhong with a smile on his face, a bit of mockery in his eyes, and a look of contempt in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. And just after this moment, Li Junzhong realized that Lin Yu was just deliberately teasing him. He simply did not have that kind of power. Li Junzhong slowly got up and wiped away the trace of blood from the corner of his mouth. His eyes were staring directly at Lin Yu, and the murderous aura in his body was quietly released. Little guy, today I will let you know what the price is. After Li Junzhong finished speaking, he violently attacked Lin Yu's chest again. For a moment, Lin Yu felt this surge of power in his chest. The situation on the field suddenly changed at this moment. After Lin Yu took several steps back, he changed from an offensive posture to a defensive posture. At this time, Li Junzhong also laughed so hard, as if he had encountered the happiest thing in the world. He laughed wildly, and his eyes and eyebrows were filled with excitement and joy. After seeing this scene, although Lin Yu was extremely angry in his heart, he still forced himself to suppress the anger in his heart. At this time, Lin Yu suddenly took a step forward, and then he suddenly flew forward, swung his right arm, and hit the guy's chest heavily. But at this time, Lin Yu didn't know why he could clearly feel his strength, which seemed to be much worse than before. The king of Guzhou in the distance also shook his head at that time, and finally raised a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. In the corners of his eyes and eyebrows, a few contempt flashed across his eyes and eyebrows, and above his eyebrows, people were quite unexpected. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji-Sheng Chang. Chapter 224. I'm afraid this little guy will be defeated this time. King Guzhou just spoke softly and unhurriedly, with a bit of mockery in his eyes and a bit of contempt in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. Obviously King Guzhou was very disdainful of the methods used by this guy, but Lin Yu was hit one after another, which made King Guzhou even more contemptuous of Lin Yu. After waiting for this moment, King Guzhou seemed to suddenly understand something. He turned his head and glanced at the tomb guard, and then waved his hand gently. This little guy can stand up and be useful to us, so he can't die yet. You must have seen the methods this guy uses. Go help him and solve this trouble. After hearing King Guzhou say this, the tombkeeper's eyes evoked some complex colors, and then a hint of helplessness flashed in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. Why does it have to be me? Can't this woman go? King Guzhou smiled. Of course I have a reason for sending you there. Do you really want to go against my will? The king of Guzhou's eyes were burning like torches. At this moment, his eyes seemed to be about to burst out with fire. A bit of cold murderous intention flashed in his eyes, and a cold and stern momentum began to spread. In just a moment, in just this breath, King Guzhou suddenly stood up and stepped forward, then grabbed the tombkeeper's collar and threw it directly towards the field. Got out. At this time, Lin Yu was beaten and retreated, and he had no power to fight back. At this time, the tombkeeper suddenly appeared in front of Lin Yu, which made Lin Yu see a little hope. Lin Yu's eyes were like this. I turned around and glanced at the king of Guzhou, and the corner of his mouth was also a faint smile flashed across his face. The king of Guzhou just waved his hand gently, with quite a bit of amusement in his eyes. After waiting for this moment, Lin Yu suddenly jumped into the air. It was naturally impossible for Li Junzhong to let Lin Yu go so easily. In his dictionary, he never had any intention of holding back. At this time, Li Junzhong only had one thought in his mind, which was to eradicate the root cause. This time, he must kill Lin Yu completely. The gravekeeper stepped forward and blocked Li Junzhong. His eyes were fixed on Li Junzhong, and a vague murderous intention was quietly released from his body. Friend, now your opponent is not that little guy, but me. How about it? Are you interested in trying a few moves? After Li Junzhong heard what the tombkeeper said, he walked directly past the tombkeeper and stared at Lin Yu. Boy, I will kill you this time. Even if this guy comes, it will have no effect. No one can protect you. At this moment, when Lin Yu heard what Li Junzhong said, there was quite a bit of contempt in his eyes. After all, although he didn't know much about the strength of the tombkeeper, he also knew that this guy's strength might not be better than his own. Down. As for Lin Yu, he was still hiding his strength at this time. The reason why he made himself look so embarrassed was just to show off to King Guzhou. Of course, Lin Yu understood one thing very well, that is, King Guzhou was an out-and-out old fox. Naturally, he had to act more childish in front of the old fox. If the old fox discovered the clues, he would have to deal with him in advance. Thinking of countermeasures, he has no way to fight with it. So when Lin Yu thought of this, A meaningful smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and after this moment, the king of Guzhu seemed to suddenly understand something. For a moment, as he breathed and breathed, his eyes looked at Lin Yu with some deep meaning, and he nodded with satisfaction. Little guy, I didn't expect that you could really get along with me, but so what? There are some things that you can't control. King Guzhu spoke to Lin Yu softly. At this time, Lin Yu seemed to be able to see the mouth shape of the king of Guzhu at this moment. After a while, Lin Yu seemed to suddenly understand something. He suddenly took a step forward. In just a moment, he had already reached the side of King Guzhu. Everyone's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu's movements. Even the king of Guzhu never expected that Lin Yu would actually want to use Li Junzhong to test his own strength. Of course he understood Lin Yu's little thoughts. After waiting for this moment, a faint smile appeared on the corner of Guzhu King's mouth. He just shook his head and turned his head to look at Lin Yu. Boy, some people are so smart that they arouse resentment from others. Do you think you are such a person? The king of Guzhu said in a cold and unhurried voice. At this time, Lin Yu suddenly smiled. I personally feel that I am not such a talented person. I think King Guzhu has a deep prejudice against me, so I think so. At this time, Li Junzhong suddenly grabbed Lin Yu again. The king of Guzhu seemed to want to give Lin Yu a blow, so he just snorted coldly, and then he just said this a heavy flick of the sleeves. Li Junzhong was instantly thrown away by King Guzhu, and he fell heavily to the ground. The king of Guzhu seemed to be quite angry, so he suddenly stepped forward and came to Li Junzhong, and then a black-yellow aura condensed in his palm, and he suddenly smashed on Li Junzhen's chest. When this breath entered Li Junzhen's chest, Li Junzhen's eyes widened, his eyes full of unwillingness and disbelief. Li Junzhong struggled desperately, grabbing desperately, as if he wanted to catch these things, but after a while, Li Junzhen's breath suddenly became weak, and then he died like this. King Guzhu subconsciously glanced coldly at Lin Yu, with a somewhat contemptuous smile on his lips. Little guy, I wonder if you are satisfied this time. Of course Lin Yu knew that if he could easily deal with Li Junzhong, this king of Guzhu was definitely not a kind person, so at this time he just coughed lightly. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Chang. Chapter 225. King Guzhu is really powerful. I really admire him. This casual remark pushed King Guzhu to the forefront of the storm. However, King Guzhu also understood Lin Yu's thoughts and waved his hand gently. Thank you. At this moment, Lin Yu seemed to understand something, and King Guzhu's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and there seemed to be a murderous aura in his eyes and eyebrows. Obviously, the little guy's actions just now had completely annoyed King Guzhu. King Guzhu flashed forward and came to Lin Yu's side, whispering in his ear, Little guy, I'm going to say this today. This is the first and last time, but if there is a next time, you should know what my methods are. King Guzhu's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and the faint smile at the corner of his mouth seemed to be full of aggression. At this moment, Lin Yu suddenly had a few ominous premonitions in his heart. After a while, he just waved his hand and smiled. King Guzhu doesn't need to be so angry. Boy, I will never do such excessive things next time. Both of them are old foxes, and the confrontation is full of temptation. After Li Junzhong died, Lin Yu came to Chen Bing's side. He looked at Wang Yu and then frowned into a Chuan character. After King Guzhu found Wang Yu, he came to Wang Yu in an instant. At this time, he squatted down and rolled up Wang Yu's sleeves. Sure enough, he found the 7-star mole on Wang Yu's left hand. After King Guzhu saw the 7-star mole on Wang Yu's hand, his eyes and eyebrows were full of joy, and that joy could not be suppressed at all. Sure enough, it's the bloodline of my Ji family. I didn't expect that after so many years, someone could inherit such pure royal blood. That's great, that's great. At this time, King Guzhu was a little incoherent. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu and Chen Bing looked at each other, with a bit of confusion in their eyes. They didn't know why King Guzhu had become like this. Is this the descendant of your Ji family? After hearing what Lin Yu said, King Guzhu turned his head and looked at him, and then nodded slightly. Yes, this is the descendant of my Ji family. The gravekeeper listens to the order. After hearing the voice of King Guzhu, the gravekeeper suddenly stepped forward, came to the side of King Guzhu, clasped his hands, and bowed respectfully to King Guzhu. I don't know what the prince ordered. At this time, the king of Guzhu pointed at the unconscious Wang Yu. She will be your master in the future. You have to listen to what he says. Can you do this? The king of Guzhu stared at the gravekeeper. The gravekeeper was stunned at first, and then nodded heavily. Of course I can do it. The king of Guzhu waved his hand gently. It's good that I can do it. There is nothing for you here for the time being. You go down first. The gravekeeper nodded slightly at this time, and then retreated carefully. The king of Guzhu's eyes were full of joy, and the joy in his heart could not be concealed at all. It is a great blessing for my Ji family to have successors. At this time, Lin Yu saw that the king of Guzhu was so excited, and there was a flash of confusion in his eyes, and then his brows frowned slightly, and his eyes were full of a different color. At this moment, after seeing this scene, Lin Yu's eyes were full of confusion. He couldn't understand why the king of Guzhu was like this. He was just so excited when he found a descendant of his family. It was a bit unreasonable. However, at this time, Lin Yu just stood quietly aside and didn't say anything more. And just after this moment, a figure suddenly rushed out. The figure rushed straight to Wang Yu's heart and grabbed him suddenly. Looking at the posture, it seemed that he wanted to kill Wang Yu completely, as if the two people had a deep hatred and would not stop until they died. At this moment, although the king of Guzhu was full of joy, after seeing this scene, he still couldn't help but have a few cold murderous intentions in his heart. The cold momentum began to quietly emerge, and a cold feeling rushed out. An angry roar came out from the mouth of the king of Guzhu. Asshole, you dare to be so presumptuous, you are simply courting death. After the king of Guzhu finished speaking, his eyes flashed with a bit of gloom, and his eyes were full of a kind of coldness. At this moment, he also suddenly attacked, and then just waved his hand lightly, and the man was directly knocked out, and finally fell heavily to the ground. However, after the figure just fell to the ground, it seemed as if it had merged with the earth and disappeared without a trace, giving people a very mysterious and strange feeling. After King Guzhu saw this scene, a special color flashed in his eyes, and then he took a deep breath and calmed down his mood a little. It's interesting. It's really interesting. In fact, the play is so ridiculous. I didn't expect this little guy to be from the Shadow Clan. It's normal for the Shadow Clan to want to kill my people. After the Tombkeeper heard the profound words of the king of Guzhu, he also stepped back one after another and said, I will send people to investigate this matter. King Guzhu nodded lightly, then turned his head and glanced at the tomb guard. A few meaningful smiles appeared at the corners of his mouth, and his eyes were full of teasing. Then you'd better find these guys, because if you can't find these guys by then, you will be the one who suffers. The king of Guzhu just said this unhurriedly, and after a moment, he turned around and left. Only after the king of Guzhu left for a moment did the tomb guard realize that his back was completely wet with cold sweat. After the king of Guzhu walked a few steps, he stopped and turned around. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Chang. Chapter 226. Why are you still standing there? It's time to come over. The king of Guzhu said coldly. At this time, Lin Yu was facing Guzhu King from a distance and just waved his hand lightly. I still have some matters of my own to deal with. There seemed to be a strange beast here just now, but it seemed to have escaped and disappeared after discovering you. The king of Guzhu heard Lin Yu, and after saying this, the corners of his mouth slightly raised in a special arc, and then he waved his hand gently. You don't have much time to waste, so make a quick decision and move faster. After hearing what the king of Guzhu said, Lin Yu nodded so heavily, and then disappeared from everyone's sight. Bai Han came to Chen Bing's side, glanced at Chen Bing, and extended his hand in a friendly manner, but was slapped away by Chen Bing. Bai Han didn't feel embarrassed at all. Instead, he retracted his hand and coughed lightly. I didn't expect Wang Yu's identity to be so extraordinary and related to that kind of master. Chen Bing didn't say a word, but slowly stood up and walked outside. Bai Han looked at Chen Bing's back, a bit of coldness flashed in his eyes, and the murderous intent on his body quietly emerged. Out. My dear, why are you pretending to be so noble here? When I get the chance later, I will make you beg for mercy. At this moment, Bai Han, after thinking of this, a bit of gloom flashed in his eyes, and the sneer at the corner of his mouth began to become more and more obvious. At this time, Chen Bing was only thinking about the man just now. Lin Yu's figure seemed to be engraved in her mind, making it impossible for Chen Bing to forget it. Chen Bing's eyes flashed with confusion, and then a wry smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. What is your identity? At this moment, Chen Bing was even more confused after thinking about this. Perhaps the girl will always have other feelings for the person she meets in times of crisis. Of course Chen Bing is no exception. At this time, Chen Bing's eyes flashed with a bit of complexity, the corners of his eyes and brows raised a bit of helplessness, and the corners of his mouth evoked a wry smile. At this time, she had no idea about when she would see Lin Yu again, and was naturally very confused. And just after this moment, Lin Yu seemed to suddenly remember something. Wait a minute, why did this ice and fire beast suddenly disappear? When this ice and fire beast disappeared, it seemed that it happened to be the time when the king of Guzhu came. Is it possible that this ice and fire beast is inextricably linked to the king of Guzhu? Can't get in touch. At this time, when Lin Yu thought of this, some profound colors flashed in his eyes. He raised his eyebrows slightly, and there was something strange in his eyes. At this time, Lin Yu felt that a large invisible net was slowly spreading towards him. Lin Yu's name is naturally resounding around the world. Although the official said that the live broadcast was faulty, Lin Yu's outstanding performance before that was enough to make audiences around the world remember him. But now Lin Yu seemed to be encountering some problems. The more he thought about this matter, the more he felt that something was wrong. However, in the end, Lin Yu didn't know whether his thoughts were right or wrong. However, Lin Yu had one good thing, that is, the things that made him too entangled were simply ignored. In the end, I stopped thinking about it. And just a moment later, Lin Yu followed the scent of the ice and fire beasts and came to a narrow tomb. This tomb was not too big, at least compared to the size of the ice and fire beasts, it was not large at all. Even if it means nothing. At this time, Lin Yu looked around like this. There was a bit of complexity in his eyes, and then there was a hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. It's interesting. It's really interesting. There's no need to hide anymore. What's the point of hiding? You'd better come out quickly. I'm very curious about your true identity. At this moment, Lin Yu was talking unhurriedly. At this time, the ice and fire beast walked out slowly, swung his tail, his eyes were filled with a ferocious look, and the murderous intention on his body also emerged quietly. You're going to regret it, little one. Lin Yu just spread his hands gently like this, with a somewhat disdainful sneer at the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were full of contempt and ridicule. Will I regret it? Maybe, but before I regret it, I believe it will definitely be you who regret it, because you are going to die today. Lin Yu didn't show too much surprise that the ice and fire beasts could speak human words, because he had seen too many strange beasts that could speak human words. At this time, the ice and fire beast had a cold light flashing in its eyes, and the killing intent on its body began to become more and more obvious. "Are you here to take my life?" Lin Yu nodded slightly. After hearing what Lin Yu said, the ice and fire beast only had a slight sneer on its lips. "I'm afraid you don't have this ability. Although you are not weak, do you know why I brought you here?" At this time, Lin Yu suddenly had a somewhat ominous premonition in his heart. At this moment, the door behind Lin Yu was violently closed. At this time, a special color flashed in Lin Yu's eyes, and something strange flashed in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. "What on earth is going on? You were just deliberately playing these tricks on me, right? It's ridiculous to say it. Haven't you heard that in the face of absolute strength, all plots and tricks will be defeated? Writing is nothing but false talk, not worth mentioning at all." After hearing what Lin Yu said, the ice and fire beast's eyes flashed with a bit of coldness, and there was also a sneer at the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were full of contempt and ridicule. "Your strength? It's just a ridiculous talk, and it's just a nonsense about the dead. Do you really think you are so strong? Today I'm here to show you, what are you talking about? That's what is called a true strong man." The ice and fire beast suddenly dodged forward, and then took a direct step forward. His speed was extremely fast, and he was already in front of Lin Yu in just one breath and one breath. Then it swung its tail. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 227. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu's face suddenly darkened, and his eyes showed a rare solemnity. He just wanted to dodge and hide to the side, but the ice and fire beast didn't give Lin Yu any chance. Although Lin Yu dodged the tail of the ice and fire beast at this time, the ice and fire beast immediately swung a claw towards Lin Yu's chest again. At this moment, Lin Yu did not hesitate at all. A faint smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were full of contempt and mockery. "It's just a trifle, it's ridiculous to say it, I didn't expect that he would dare to show off his skills in front of an expert, ridiculous, ridiculous." At this moment, Lin Yu's mind moved and then he made a hand gesture. "He-Lu Yu." At this moment, He-Lu Yu suddenly appeared in front of the ice and fire beast. After the ice and fire beast felt the powerful aura of He-Lu Yu, it was instantly filled with fear. The ice and fire beast subconsciously wanted to escape from here, but Lin Yu's mouth curled up a sneer. "Is it too late to escape now? What do you think?" At this moment, Lin Yu said slowly. At this time, after hearing what Lin Yu said, the ice and fire beast suddenly felt a sudden shudder in his heart, and suddenly had an ominous premonition in his heart. Lin Yu suddenly jumped up, and then he kicked the ice and fire beast in the chest. The ice and fire beast retreated madly. And the He-Lu Yu also suddenly swam towards the ice and fire beast. The nine tails were swinging, and there seemed to be a little ripple in the space. He-Lu Yu's body flipped up and down, moved left and right, giving people an indescribable feeling. The ice and fire beast desperately fled backwards, but in the end there was still no place to hide, no way to avoid, and the He-Lu Yu rushed towards the ice and fire beast. In just a moment, He-Lu Yu had already arrived between the ice and fire beast, and then suddenly flicked his tail, and the ice and fire beast was wilted by He-Lu Yu's disorder, and was completely entangled. The ice and fire beast at this time looked quite sympathetic, and He-Lu Yu let out a few low roars from his mouth, which made people feel a little indescribable. And just after this moment, He-Lu Yu seemed to understand something, and in a moment, he had already arrived in front of the ice and fire beast, and then strangled it completely. Lin Yu always felt that the strength of the later ice and fire beast seemed not as strong as before. But just when He-Lu Yu was about to let go of the ice and fire beast, Lin Yu's face was shocked, and there was a flash of fear in his eyes, and there was a kind of disbelief in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. Oh no! He Liu was confused, and had no idea why Lin Yu was like this now. Lin Yu's mind moved, and he quickly put He Liu away. At this time, Lin Yu came to the ice and fire beast, and then began to carefully search the body of the ice and fire beast. After he searched for a while, he seemed to be a deflated ball, with a bitter smile on the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were full of helplessness, and then he shook his head. Sure enough, it's just an eyeliner, I didn't expect it, I didn't expect it. At this time, the face of the king of Guzhu suddenly became gloomy. This little guy is really extraordinary, he really has a secret. When King Guzhu thought of this, a special color flashed in his eyes. At this moment, he seemed to be forcibly suppressing the cold and gloomy murderous aura on his body. But a moment later, King Guzhu suddenly laughed. The prehistoric beast in the classic of mountains and seas, the Hiluo fish, I heard that this thing is good for making soup. I wonder if you still remember the cooking method. King Guzhu said and looked to the side, and then a shadow suddenly appeared beside King Guzhu. The shadow looked at King Guzhu, his eyes full of confusion. Why do you do this? I am getting more and more confused about your approach. After hearing what the man said, King Guzhu suddenly laughed, his eyes were quite playful, and the corners of his mouth even raised a playful smile. There are some things you don't need to know. You just need to do what I say. I will do what I promised you, but you don't seem to have done enough for what you promised me. That's the descendant of the G family you tried so hard to find, but you just wanted me to kill him. But you killed me when I was about to do it. I don't understand why. The corners of King Guzhu's mouth showed a meaningful smile, because I suddenly realized that she can't die now. She still has some use for me, so she naturally has to live a few more days. Do you understand this? King Guzhu's eyes were staring at the shadow. After Shadow heard what King Guzhu said, although there was still a bit of confusion in his eyes, he didn't say anything more. Anyway, I just want to complete what you told me. As for the rest, I don't care about it, and it has nothing to do with me. After the shadow finished speaking, he disappeared directly from the spot. At this moment, the tomb keeper in the distance seemed to be accustomed to all this. You asked me to keep an eye on Miss, and I have done as you asked. What's next? After King Guzhu heard what the tomb keeper said, he waved his hand in an understatement. Someone will come to kill her in a few days. What you need to do then is to cooperate and put on a good show to gain her absolute trust. You should know how to kill her. After the tomb keeper heard what King Gujo said, he was slightly startled at first, but after a moment he nodded lightly. Of course I understand the bitter plan, and I'll start doing it now. As the tomb keeper said this, he stepped back cautiously. After hearing what he said, King Guzhu also nodded with satisfaction. You can teach me. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 228. At this time, after hearing what King Guzhu said, the tomb keeper was confused for a while. He had no idea why King Guzhu was like this, and what the collapse was. Want to do something? However, the tomb keeper also understands one thing very well, that is, he should not ask questions by himself. It is best not to ask random questions, because if he asks casually, he is likely to offend the king of Guzhu and offend Guzhu. Wang, it is not of any benefit to him at present. At this time, after the tomb keeper respectfully stepped back, King Guzhu's eyes were fixed on the back of the tomb keeper. After looking there for a long time, he calmly withdrew his gaze. It's interesting, but it's really interesting. The affairs of the world are not the shores of the king and the land, and the affairs of the world are the ministers of the king and the land. Don't say there is no cause and effect under the end of the world. At this time, Lin Yu received a reward from the system after killing the ice and fire beast, but he was not happy either. For some reason, Lin Yu always felt as if he was being calculated against. He didn't like this calculation very much, so at this time, his face was gloomy, as if water was dripping from his face. After a while, Lin Yu seemed to suddenly remember something. He suddenly sat up in shock, and then a little light flashed in his eyes. No, there seems to be something wrong, there seems to be some problem. Lin Yu's voice wasn't too loud, but it wasn't too quiet either, but a moment later he heard the sound of shoes hitting the ground. Lin Yu's eyes looked towards the direction where the voice came from. His eyes were quite gloomy. At this moment, he half squinted his eyes, and a bit of fierceness flashed in his eyes. Sex, he deliberately lowered his voice and said calmly. What's the point of pretending? Why don't you show up obediently and ask me to see who it is? Lin Yu said coldly. At this moment, the man slowly walked up to Lin Yu. You are a little too nervous, you can't even hear my voice. At this time, Lin Yu took a closer look and realized that the person in front of him could not be the king of Guzhu. Both sides basically knew each other's details, so at this time Lin Yu just smiled and shook his head. I didn't expect that it was actually the legendary king of Guzhu, boy Lin Yu. I want to pay my respects to the king of Guzhu. The king of Guzhu just waved his hands so gently, and the corners of his mouth also evoked a few meaningful smiles. It doesn't matter. In fact, you don't need to be so wary of me. After all, many things don't matter to me. As the king of Guzhu spoke, he glanced in Lin Yu's direction, with a somewhat complicated meaning in his eyes. Lin Yu certainly understood what King Guzhu meant by his words, so at this time, he clasped his hands and saluted King Guzhu. King Guzhu is joking. The king of Guzhu just waved his hand gently. How do you look like I'm joking? That horo fish of yours is amazing. If you have time, I wonder if you can teach me how to see it. King Guzhu's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Guzhu King said, his face suddenly sank, and his eyes were even more solemn. His eyes were fixed on him. On the body of the king of Guzhu. I don't know what Lord Guzhu Wang means by this. How do you understand me? I don't understand. King Guzhu waved his hand. Don't you understand? Or are you pretending to be confused? Of course I don't understand. After all, Lord Guzhu Wang, the meaning of these words is quite obscure and difficult to understand. King Guzhu also laughed loudly at that time, and then he waved his hands and shook his head. You kid is very sharp-tongued, but this is of no use to me. You should know that I don't like those sharp-tongued people. A profiteer. Lin Yu originally wanted to turn this matter into a big deal, turn it into a trivial matter, and pass it by in a flash, but now it seems that King Guzhu has no such intention. At this time, Lin Yu half squinted his eyes and stared at the king of Guzhu, feeling quite emotional in his heart. Of course the king of Guzhu knew that Lin Yu was probably murderous at this moment, but people like him didn't need to be afraid of Lin Yu at all. At this moment, the king of Guzhu suddenly laughed. Little guy, I can pretend that I don't know about your Holuyu, but there is something I want to ask you, and you have to answer truthfully. Lin Yu nodded gently. What do you want to say? Where did you find this Holuyu fish? You must know that nearly 90% of the strange beasts in the classic of mountains and seas have become extinct, and less than 10% of the remaining ones live in seclusion in the deep mountains and old forests, and have never been seen again. I'm not going out anymore, but you actually have such a horo fish in your hand, which really baffles me. This is why the curiosity in the heart of the king of Guzhu comes from this. You must know that although this Holuyu has pure blood, the king of Guzhu really looked down upon him back then. But now, it is different from those days, and this Holuyu the fish had been extinct for a long time, and now it has reappeared, which is obviously something strange. Of course, Lin Yu couldn't say that he got it from this store, so at this time, he could only think of other ways to deal with it. Actually, King Guzhu's eyes narrowed to a slit. Although he was still smiling at this moment, the vague killing intent in his body, after being displayed in this way, gave people a sense of oppression. Feel. If it is not convenient to answer, then there is no need to answer. King Guzhu said softly, but everyone could see that the power condensed in his palm was not as amiable as he said. At this time, Lin Yu also shook his head and smiled. What King Guzhu said was just a joke. How could it be inconvenient for me to answer? In fact, it doesn't matter. In the early years, I had an adventure in the Tianese Sea. I found an egg by chance, but I didn't recognize it, so I kept it in the storage ring until a few days ago, by chance, it hatched. When the king of Guzhu heard Lin Yu's words, his face suddenly lit up with joy. The sea in the south of the sky, right? You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 229. Lin Yu could only nod with difficulty. Even for a big man like Guzhu Wang, the joy on his face at this moment was still difficult to conceal, and he nodded heavily. The South Sea, very good, it is the South Sea. I wonder if you are free to go with me in a few days. The eyes of Guzhu Wang were fixed on Lin Yu. At first, Lin Yu was slightly stunned, but after a moment, he nodded heavily. Since the Lord Guzhu Wang has spoken, the boy will obey. The Guzhu king also laughed at that time. Ha ha ha, very good, I said that you are not bad, you are a talent. Do you have anything else to deal with? If there is nothing to deal with, why not go back with me? Lin Yu just nodded lightly. The king of Guzhu stared at Lin Yu, and after a moment, the two of them left one after the other. Wang Yu looked at the male snake man at this time, and a bit of panic flashed in her eyes. For some reason, she always felt that the beautiful big sister in front of her had a murderous intention spreading. At this time, the male snake man looked at the harmless person in front of him, and the little girl relaxed her vigilance. Why did you catch me? Someone will tell you why at that time, but it won't be me, the male snake man said coldly. At this time, King Guzhu and Lin Yu came over together. The male snake man looked at King Guzhu, then bowed respectfully, and then retreated carefully. At this time, King Guzhu and Lin Yu walked in front of Wang Yu. For some reason, Wang Yu suddenly felt that the person in front of him seemed to have some resonance with him in terms of blood. After a while, Wang Yu blinked his big watery eyes and stared at the king of Guzhu in front of him. Who are you? Why do I feel so familiar when I see you? The king of Guzhu smiled and said, you are a descendant of my Ji clan, and a member of the royal family of the previous Zhou dynasty. In fact, I should be considered your ancestor, so it's not surprising that you feel this way. The king of Guzhu said this slowly. After hearing what the king of Guzhu said, Wang Yu nodded slightly at that time. I see, I was thinking so. At this time, the king of Guzhu suddenly smiled. Little girl, now that you have finished asking questions, should I ask you something? Wang Yu was also slightly stunned at first, and then nodded slightly. Okay, just ask whatever you want. Who are you? After knowing your true identity, her eyes seemed to become dim, and a bitter smile appeared on the corner of her mouth. My parents died after I was born. This is a strange thing. Maybe every time I fall asleep, I will have a strange dream. It's strange, right? Who are your parents? And did anything strange happen after you were born? At this moment, Wang Yu always felt that I had been to this tomb before when he heard the series of questions from King Guzhu. To be precise, I have been here in my dream. King Guzhu nodded with satisfaction. This makes sense. At this time, King Guzhu seemed to have suddenly remembered something. He turned his head and stared at Wang Yu with his eyes. feeling quite excited. Wait, what did you just say? Are you saying that you have been to this tomb in your dream? Then tell me, what did you see in this tomb? The king of Guzhu stared at Wang Yu. He was probably too excited at the moment, so the strength in his hand was a little bit too strong. At this time, Wang Yu's face was also shocked, and she screamed. Ah, it hurts. You hurt me. The king of Guzhu realized that he might be too excited, so he smiled slightly at this time, and then waved his hand. Sorry, it's all my fault, it's all my fault that I was too excited just now. At this time, Wang Yu stared at the king of Guzhu, her eyes were quite panicked, and then she subconsciously leaned towards Lin Yu and grabbed the corner of Lin Yu's clothes. Although she didn't remember much about the previous events, she could remember that she seemed to have dreamed of a man in her trance. The man looked exactly like Lin Yu, and it seemed that the man had saved her. So Wang Yu still had a good impression of Lin Yu at this moment, and Wang Yu also felt quite safe around Lin Yu. After seeing this scene, the king of Guzhu flashed a bit of helplessness in his eyes, and a bitter smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. However, a big shot like him didn't care about this. He just waved his hand gently. It's okay, it's okay. I was too excited just now and scared you. It's really my fault. At this time, a strange light flashed in the eyes of King Guzhu, and at this time Lin Yu seemed to remember something. He turned his head and looked at King Guzhu. You want to ask what is in this tomb? Is it what your brother has always wanted to convey to his descendants? King Guzhu was also slightly stunned at first, but after a moment, he nodded gently, and then sighed faintly. Yes, I do want to ask this. It seems that he is frightened now. Let's wait for her to calm down a little before continuing to ask about this matter. King Guzhu said, and wanted to turn around and leave. At this time, Lin Yu also wanted to leave with King Guzhu. Just when Lin Yu was about to leave, Wang Yu grabbed the corner of Lin Yu's clothes, and there was a bit of pleading in his eyes, as if he wanted Lin Yu to stay here with her. There was a hint of helplessness in Lin Yu's eyes, and a bitter smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. After seeing this scene, King Guzhu did not blame Lin Yu, but gently waved his hand towards Lin Yu. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Chang. Chapter 230. If she wants you to stay with him here, you can stay here with her safely. At this moment, Lin Yu heard King Guzhu say this and nodded slightly. King Guzhu turned around and left immediately. After King Guzhu left, Lin Yu turned around and glanced at Wang Yu, with a faint smile on his lips. Tell me, what do you want to say to me when you leave me alone? Don't think I don't know that you have something you want to hide from King Guzhu, right? Wang Yu nodded slightly. At this moment, she timidly came to Lin Yu's side, and then hugged Lin Yu like this. Nephrite could not be said to be calm in Lin Yu's arms. The look in his eyes, there was quite a bit of confusion, and there was also such a slight doubt in my heart. What on earth do you want to say? You don't have to do this, you don't have to betray your lust like this. After Wang Yu heard what Lin Yu said, his pretty face darkened and he stared at Lin Yu. What are you thinking, you bastard? Do you think I am that kind of woman? At this moment, after Lin Yu heard what Wang Yu said, he just shook his head and smiled. I'm sorry, I really shouldn't have said that just now. At this moment, Wang Yu hit Lin Yu's ear. Actually, in this dream, I always dreamed of him, as if he had killed someone, but I didn't know who it was, because every time I wanted to see that face clearly, I would always wake up. After Lin Yu heard Wang Yu say this, his expression was suddenly startled. A look of disbelief flashed in his eyes. He turned his head and stared directly at Wang Yu. Are you telling the truth? Wang Yu nodded so gently, and his timid look made people feel a bit pity. Absolutely true, not even an ounce of lies. Lin Yu took a deep breath and calmed down his mood a little. I will trust you this time. You told me all this, so you think I will help you, right? Lin Yu turned around and glanced at Wang Yu, with a somewhat complicated meaning in his eyes. At this time, Wang Yu nodded timidly, with a bitter smile on the corner of his mouth. If you don't help me now, then there will really be no one to help me, so now I can only look at you. At this moment, Lin Yu took a deep breath and calmed down his mood a little. Okay, but you must keep this matter in your heart. No one can talk about it. Otherwise, I'm afraid that even I can't help you. Wang Yu nodded heavily. No one knew what she was thinking at this moment. And just after this moment, Wang Yu seemed to remember something. Wait a minute, there's something I still need to tell you. After Lin Yu heard what Wang Yu said, she turned her head and glanced at him, and then a faint smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. If you have anything else to say, just tell me. Chen Bing seems to be very important. I don't know why, but I always feel that the same thing happens when I see Chen Bing again. When Wang Yu said this, he paused. At this moment, he just covered his head and rolled his face back and forth. His face was filled with a look of pain. Lin Yu ducked in front of Wang Yu and followed suit. After Wang Yu's meridian slowly helped her breathe, Wang Yu finally returned to her previous calm appearance. What's wrong with Chen Bing? What is that thing you didn't finish just now? Lin Yu's eyes were staring straight at Wang Yu, and there seemed to be some complicated meaning flashing through his eyes. At this time, Wang Yu also had a wry smile on his lips. It's nothing. I don't know why. When I think of these two words, my head feels like a needle pricking my head. I don't know what the reason is, but it's just a little strange. Lin Yu was very sensible when he heard what Wang Yu said, so he didn't ask any more questions. After a group of them rested for a while, they came to the tomb again. At first, there was nothing special about that tomb, but they walked forward. About halfway after about an hour, the scene in front of them suddenly became clear. After waiting for a moment, Lin Yu suddenly seemed to remember something. He suddenly came to Wang Yu's side, hugged her and jumped out. Wang Yu's eyes were also full of confusion. He didn't know what happened. After a while, Wang Yu came to his senses, and then a giant snake that was 100 feet long followed. Suddenly appeared in front of everyone. The snake is spitting out its core, and there are 3 raised places above its head. One of them is right in the middle, where a dragon horn has vaguely appeared. At this time, Lin Yu's eyes flashed with a bit of solemnity. This is the Dulong Xiao. It became extinct 1,000 years ago. I didn't expect you can still see it here. The king of Guzhu was also slightly stunned. At this time, the eyes of the king of Guzhu flashed a bit solemnly. He half squinted his eyes, and then he couldn't help but shook his head, and the corners of his mouth curled up. There was a bit of a wry smile. This big guy really has quite a bit of history, it can't be said, it can't be said. The king of Guzhu just sighed softly. At this time, Lin Yu didn't know why he always felt that the king of Guzhu was deliberately hiding these things from him. This feeling was indeed a bit strange. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Guzhu King. What's going on? Do you know anything else? King Guzhu half squinted his eyes, as if he was lost in memories. At this time, he also sighed leisurely. Oh, as early as 500 years ago, I came to this place. But at that time, the Dulong Jiao did not exist here. At that time in the future, maybe the Dulong Jiao has not hatched yet. King Guzhu said softly. At this moment, Lin Yu, after hearing what he said, there was something special in his eyes. Maybe it's true, maybe at the beginning, the Dulong Jiao had not hatched yet, but maybe it was not the case. This is the Dulong Jiao. It became extinct 1,000 years ago. I didn't expect you can still see it here. The king of Guzhu was also slightly stunned. At this time, a bit of solemnity flashed in the eyes of the king of Guzhu. He half squinted his eyes, and then he couldn't help but shook his head, and the corners of his mouth curled up. There was a bit of a wry smile. This big guy really has quite a bit of history, it's hard to tell, it's hard to tell. The king of Guzhu just sighed softly. At this time, Lin Yu didn't know why he always felt that the king of Guzhu was deliberately hiding these things from him. This feeling was indeed a bit strange. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Guzhu King. What's going on? Do you know anything else? King Guzhu half squinted his eyes, as if he was lost in memories. At this time, he also sighed leisurely. Oh, as early as 500 years ago, I came to this place. But at that time, the Dulongjiao did not exist here. At that time in the future, maybe the Dulongjiao has not hatched yet. King Guzhu said softly. At this moment, Lin Yu, after hearing what he said, there was something special in his eyes. Maybe it's true, maybe at the beginning, the Dulongjiao had not hatched yet, but maybe it was not the case.